Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest edition of Remastered TFOS, where I take old stories I've narrated and give them a second go. This particular story is called The Trash Jumpers, written by RegalLegalEagle. Elder Thantos sat on the edge of the meeting hall, looking out over the river valley below. The large campfire he always remembered as a child crackled and snapped behind him. But the canvas tents had been replaced by stone and marble. Indeed, his people's homes had grown greatly since the fateful day so long ago. They had a real city now, streets, houses, and a small but growing library. His people were no longer just farmers. They could do and be whatever they wanted with their lives. The fields stretched out as far as the eye could see. The harvest was almost upon them, and you could see a few of the tenders wandering out there, the light of the twin moons holding true dark at bay. Past the fields were the trash mountains, although they hadn't had much trash in a long time. The young ones simply called them the Bone Hills, since they looked like the bones of a pheasant that had been picked clean by scavengers. But to Thantos, they would always be the trash mountains. He looked up then into the clear sky at the large white blue moon, Sek and his younger sister, the pale purple Rez, stretching out along the sky, however, were the trash rings, the remains of an ancient battle that happened long before his time, the battle that had brought the trash jumpers here. Behind him, he heard the hushed tones and looked over his shoulder to see a herd of children looking his way and whispering. One was out in front, seemingly ready to build up the courage to talk to him. Thantos decided to make it easy on them. The elder grumbled a bit and rose up, letting his forelegs stretch out from under him, using his two upper hands to push a little. He was getting old, but he wasn't helpless yet. His long, shaggy mane remained simple and unfettered by the styles and trinkets kids these days like to weave into their own. The children gasped as he approached. A giant even amongst his own kind, he wandered closer to the warmth of the fire, and then settled back down on his legs. He looked around at the group of children, who were all hushed, and yet obviously wanted to ask. He knew their parents had filled their little heads with lies about his great deeds through his life. Everyone seemed to think that he was a hero. All he had done was break the old laws, the laws about never hurting a living creature, the oldest and most sacred of their vows when he was young. He never liked the stories, but there was a story he did like. So, young ones, do you want to hear the story of the trash jumpers? They clambered up then, excitement alight in their eyes, as they shouted and agreed in varied tones, depending on how much they had heard before. He took a deep breath and rumbled out softly as he looked back over the field, out towards the trash mountains. Do you know why we used to call those the trash mountains? He asked, pointing with one of his 3 fingers. It used to be covered in trash, Elder, but one day it was all stolen. Stolen? He turned back with a huff as the children skipped back. It was taken, but it was not stolen. It was trash. It was not ours because we never gave it a second thought. No, it was not stolen. And what do you all know of our people? How we came here? Another young one piped up. We were brought here to make food. Yes, we were. And, who brought us here? The red ones. Thantos chuckled at that, his deep baritone rumbling out across the crackling fire. Yes, the red ones. Although we called them Anatlids and their empire. They brought us here well before my time. They told us to farm, and every month they'd return to take most of what we made. Every half solar cycle, they'd wait for us to have a special ceremony to claim our elders as meat. The children gasped at that, since likely they hadn't been told that part yet, to spare them nightmares. Well, that made them soft in Thanatos' thinking, needed to let them know the real history. That's right. If I had been my age back then, I would have been meat for their bellies more than 15 solar cycles ago. But even our elders allowed it. It was the way of the things, they said. They gladly traded their lives for our continued peace on this planet. It was a simple life. Farm, gather, wait to be eaten by the Anatlids. We lived in tents made of simple canvas, twine, and sticks. Not these fancy buildings you enjoy today. But we were not alone on this planet. There were also the trash jumpers. He looked back out over the moonlit fields once more to the mountains beyond. We never knew their names. They were small, energetic. They lived in the trash and would always be seen jumping over it. So that was their name, the trash jumpers. He pointed up at the sky, to the rings of trash held in the sky by some unknown force. That was the remains of a great fleet that they had once possessed. They lost, but the survivors rained down on the planet with the trash. Generations ago, they waited until the Anatlids brought us here thinking the planet secure. Then they started to return. We had no idea what they were doing out there. To us, their lives were short and strange. He mused over his thoughts, thinking back on his own childhood. They couldn't grow much. They had to live in the mountains and hide from the Red Ones, as you call them. So they ventured down here to our home and trade with us. I didn't understand why my elders would want trash, but I learned it wasn't just trash. There were trinkets and value and little bits of tech, and we grew much food, so we were happy to trade. I remember seeing some trash fall out the sky, hitting the plains to the south, made a big hole. There was something shiny and valuable looking at the bottom, but the elders told us to let the trash jumpers get to it. The trash from the skies were dangerous, and indeed, when the trash jumpers tried to claim it, that night there was an explosion from the hole. I didn't understand. Why would they kill themselves, or at least risk death over trash? He rumbled a little and shook his head. But one glorious night when I was younger. Oh, that night. He smiled and looked up at the sky, thinking back on it. Then he pointed over to the mountains. We saw a light rising in the trash. It was glorious. It shot up towards the heaven on a pillar of flame. But before it reached the sky, it exploded. He roared out that light and startled the children, who gasped and shifted, his hands expanding to emphasize it. I realized that's what they were doing with the trash. They were building something to reach the skies. Well, I figured after that night they were done. It hadn't worked, but it didn't stop them. More trash fell from the skies, and 2 weeks after the first attempt, we saw another pillar of fire rise up. Well, this one made it. He pointed at the trash rings. We saw it rise up and vanish into the sky itself. The next day, more trash than ever rained down upon the plains. We didn't think about it at the time, but very little rained down on our fields. When I first pointed this out, the elders thought it was a simple luck. I know now that it wasn't luck. It was the trash jumpers. They didn't want to harm us on accident. Better to hurt themselves. He shrugged his broad shoulders for a moment. The Anatlids returned the next time on one of their ships. It moved much more quietly than the pillars of fire the trash jumpers had. They were tall creatures like us, very angular, claws, teeth. He pantomimed the features for the children as he spoke. They were hunters and mean ones. One of our elders tried to tell them about the pillars of fire, but they didn't believe him. They were insulted at his attempts to spare himself from the ceremony and butchered him on the spot. Thanatos shivered a little as he thought back on that night on the meeting hill, only feet away from where he sat now. After that, we didn't tell the Anatlids anything about the trash jumpers. They claimed more of our elders and left. They always picked the smartest amongst them as well. They wanted us to never stray from our task of farming after all. But the trash jumpers soon returned from their hiding holes in the trash. We saw more pillars of fire. Soon, once a night, then twice a night, and a week after that, we didn't see any more pillars of fire. Instead, we saw streaks of light. But there were more explosions during all this time. Not all their journeys were successful. I don't know how many of them died each week, but they never stopped. He rubbed his chin slowly. Then, one day, my mother and sister fell ill. It was the gray mold. Some of the food we had to grow just for the anatlids could get the strange fungus. It would take 2 or 3 days, but anyone who had it growing on them would die. The new elders told me it was simply the ways of life. They'd die and be set aflame to spare the rest of the herd. Slowly, he shook his head and pointed back at the mountains. But I knew the trash jumpers didn't think that way. I disobeyed our elders. I snuck into the tent they'd sealed up around my mother and sister. I collected some of the fungus, and I went in search of the trash jumpers. Make no mistake, I was risking being thrown from the herd and marked as an outcast. To venture beyond the valley was a grave offense back then. He thought back to that night. The fields were far longer than they looked like before that. He walked and walked and walked. It seemed to take all night, but finally, he reached the edge of the trash mountains. He looked back at the children to fill in some of his thoughts. Back when they really were trash mountains, they were covered in metal, jagged, sharp pieces mostly. It was treacherous climbing up those hills. We weren't made for it. We were made for plains. I cut myself many times, but I kept climbing up higher and higher. Then one of them found me. I remember seeing a cave in the distance, partially covered by a giant sheet of metal. I was covered in cuts and bleeding from many places when the light with no fire shined in my eyes. There were 3 trash jumpers, 2 males and 1 of their females. They had short hair, simple clothing, held tight to the body, only 2 legs, and they seemed small. So small. He sighed out as he remembered the first real encounter. In the past, he'd seen them from a distance, trading with the elders. He'd never met them face to face. I begged them, pleaded, holding out the sample of fungus. I told them I had nothing to give, but I asked for their help. They didn't even hesitate. They brought me into the cave. One of the males helped bandage my cuts, while the female prepared some sort of salve after examining the fungus in a strange metal box. I asked them what I must do to repay them. How could I ever live down the debt that they had over me? He smiled then, thinking back. They told me I had no debt. We fed them. It was their debt to us. I, of course, insisted that I owed them, but they gave me some water and escorted me back down the mountain, showing me where to travel so I wouldn't get more cuts. Once I was back on the plains, I ran home. I'd been traveling all night, but I ran. I was exhausted and sweat pouring, but I made it. I didn't even acknowledge the guard the elders had set up around my mother and sister's tent since I broke in. I rushed past him and gave them the salve the trash jumpers had given me. His smile grew to a full grin. And it worked! The fungus fell off of them. They were weak, but they were alive. Of course, I had disobeyed the elders, but they understood why. Instead of banishing me, they assigned me to 2 months of hard labor in the fields. I didn't mind. I was strong, and it only made me stronger. I began to explore the fields and the plains more. I hoped that the trash jumpers might visit, but they were busy at night. Slowly, his grin faded, and he shook his head. Then came that fateful night. The anatlids returned for the ceremony, when a piece of trash fell from the sky bigger than I'd seen before, right into the fields. They were surprised, but I convinced them that it was nothing. I'd worked in the fields more than anyone, and I told them it happened from time to time. Nothing to worry about. They seemed to believe me. Aside from one, he kept looking out from the meeting hill. He watched the field and I watched him. As the night drew on, he must have seen something because he turned and pointed at me, telling me to guide him out there. Thanatos sighed. I had no choice. I just hoped the trash jumpers were already gone when we got there. I moved slowly until he jabbed me with a talon, cutting my side, demanding that I move faster. I was scared, so I moved faster. When we got to that hole, the trash jumpers were still there. It was the 3 who had helped me. They were still crawling over some big piece that looked important. Then the Anatlid, Thanatos, became silent. He closed his eyes as he thought back on that night. He knew how he just stood there as the creature raised the long metal claws, unleashing lightning that struck the 2 males. He remembered their screams. The females struck in the side and wounded but not dead. He remembered the Anatlid, red and angry.
Go get my kin. I will torture this one and skin the others as trophies. It seems that you are not lying about the pillars of fire. You will be rewarded.
The look in her eyes, that fear and anger. Thanatos had always been taught to never harm another living creature. His people were peaceful. They ate plants, they farmed, they let themselves be sacrificed. But an anger welled up in him that he had never known. He punched the creature and heard the surprise as it staggered, his mighty fist slamming into it again, driving it to the ground before he reared up on his hind legs and stomped on it. He remembered shaking with fear and guilt right after. The anger had faded away, leaving him feeling sick. The mighty Thanatos nearly pissed himself with regret. His herd would abandon him, not just banish him. They'd chase him from their lands to die alone. Slowly, taking a breath, he looked back at the kids before him, waiting for his story to continue. I killed the Anatlid. I crushed him beneath my mighty hooves, but only after he had slain 2 of the trash jumpers. I had been weak and hesitated. I'll never forgive myself. But I picked up the injured female. She told me to grab part of the trash, and I ran. I carried her to the mountains and up. I was hasty and suffered many more cuts, but I brought her to a home. There were more trash jumpers this time, but they were in metal suits made of trash that I didn't understand at the time. They spoke in their own language, often looking at me, covered in my blood, and some of the anatlids on my front legs. They seemed to make up their minds. They escorted me back down to the fields and to my home. There were about 30 of them in those trash chutes. They told me that they were going to attack the anatlids and stop the ceremony. I couldn't believe it, but of course I agreed to help. Since our town was just tents and caverns back then, there wasn't really any place to hide them, so I just had to guide them along the quickest path to the meeting hill. There were only 9 or so anatlids left after the one I had crushed. We were peaceful and never fought back. Why would they need more than a crew for their ship? The trash jumpers charged into the meeting, but the anatlids saw. The bolts of lightning struck several of them down. But I was faster and knocked one of the anatlids down again. The trash jumpers had their own bolts of lightning from their trash chutes, and while many of them fell, the anatlids were all slain. He shook his head, thinking back on that night. The herd stared at me in horror. What had I done? I had killed a living creature. Twice now. I had angered our keepers and brought these trash jumpers into our home, to our very meeting hill. But one of the trash jumpers explained that they would protect us now. We wouldn't be meat for our captors. It sounded too good to be true to many who were scared about the return of the anatlids. But I was spared abandonment that night. He smiled then. But the next day the trash jumpers showed their true progress. They flew the anatlid ship into the sky, and we saw all the pillars of fires and streaks of light launch at once. There had been 100. Then they returned in the biggest ship that I have ever seen. It was larger than this very city. Wings stretched out, made of black and white. Not true white, however. It was scarred and scratched, old and worn from being in the sky for so long. It was massive. The trash jumpers brought it down and swarmed over it, flitting trash from mountains to the outside. And for the first time, we saw their other ships. Shaking his head, he chuckled softly. They were much like I would expect from the trash jumpers. The other ships were trash. Chunks and hunks of this and that, stuck together however they would fit. I thought they had found some ancient vessels that were simply old and dangerous. But no. They'd made them from scratch, slapping them together and likely praying that they would hold. Then they all launched off into the sky, pillars of fire, streaks of light, and that massive bone-white mountain, a flying trash mountain now, up into the sky. He sighed once more as he thought about it. The next night, the sky was on fire. Explosions, flames, light streaking through the trash. It was a spectacle I've never seen the likes of since. And the morning after, the trash mountain returned. It was belching smoke and missing pieces. And many of the other trash jumper ships did not return. But there was no Anatlids. The remains of that battle rained down upon our fields, and the plains, and the mountains. But the trash jumpers no longer hid. They swarmed out over all of it, patching together their flying trash mountain, making more ships, using everything they had. It took another month before those mountains were bare. The bone hills you see now. He grew silent then, thinking back on it. He'd been afraid to talk to the trash jumpers after his failure to save the 2 males. But the females sought him out, asked him to come to see her trash mountain. He begged forgiveness, but she once more said it was her debt to him, not the other way around. He had walked with her out to the flying trash mountain as she spoke. "We appreciate everything that you and your people have done for us, but we need to go to the skies now. We'll hunt the Anatlids, we'll find more of our own, and we'll burn their empire to the ground." "You're leaving. You're all leaving. But what will we do? You mean you'll just leave us here? Why not take us with you?" "Take you with us? No. We go in search of war and strife. You stay here. This planet is yours now. Live in peace. One day, when the Anatlids are no longer a threat, we'll return to you in peace. But you get to live your lives however you want now. No one will threaten you." Bantus was shocked and sad at the same time. He couldn't believe the trash jumpers felt so indebted for bits of food the elders didn't want. "You and your trash mountain honor us. I will make sure my people always know of our shared debt. Food for peace is a very small price." "Us and our what?" "Your trash mountain that flies." He waved at the giant ship above him. She looked up and laughed. The memory of that laugh made him smile as he stared at the fire. The next day the trash jumpers left. The side of their ship had painted on it. It was now Trash Mountain. "What happened, Elder?" one of the children asked as he had looked around to remember where he'd left off. "They left us. They flew into the stars to find the Anatlids and defeat them, to protect us and any like us from being used as food and slaves for their evil. And one day, they'll return. And we'll give them as much food as we possibly can, even if they tell us we don't need to. Because they gave us freedom. Your parents have become writers, builders, stonemasons, artists, craftsmen. They have become whatever they want. Even we collect trash now, trying to learn from it as they did. Thanks to the trash jumpers who traded trash for food and built an army and a fleet out of junk and remains to challenge the galaxy's mightiest empire." "But how did you know they're still out there, Elder? You haven't seen them since you left." "Because, young one, it has been 200 solar cycles. I am old and weary, but the Anatlids have not returned. If their foe was able to build a fleet from a little old trash, imagine what they could do with all the new trash they made by destroying the Anatlids. They're up there somewhere, and while my friend might be gone, I can pray that her offspring lives on, so I may thank them one last time." He looked up at the sky, watching a streak brush across the sky as another piece of trash fell from the heavens. End of story. There is a new legend on the horizon. Blueberry Cat has taken the T6 Patreon spot. Thank you very much, and I'm sure that I speak for everyone when I say that. I would just like to thank our T5 members, Lord Azrael, Ambrose Cattell, Quantum Wednesday, Drexoon WRE, Blueberry Cat, Cam Maxwell, Casper Arnholtz, Bushmaster 177, and Leslie 517. Thank you very much.